Okay, we're on. Good evening and welcome, those of you here in person and those of you online. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs here at NAASR, and on behalf of NAASR, the Women's Support Center, and the Armenian International Women's Association, AWA, I want to welcome everybody and thank you for making time in your busy days. A couple of very brief things for me to say before we start the program is that this program really came about because of the initiative of Lenna Garibian, from whom we will be hearing shortly, who reached out to Silva Sargsyan and me some months ago to do this program, and she had a chart and graphs and things to show why this was an important event, which of course it was obvious even without the charts and graphs that it was, and we were very glad to host it and co-sponsor it and be a part of it tonight. So thank you, Lenna, very, very much. I have one brief announcement, and it is not strictly speaking of a NAASR event, but it is that next Wednesday, May 8th, at the Cambridge Public Library Community Room, you can hear NAASR's library curator, Ani Babayan, who is also an art researcher and conservator, speak about identity through colors, exploring Armenian painting as part of the Cambridge Yerevan Sister City Association 38th Annual Membership Meeting. And I would strongly encourage you to attend. Okay. Bits of business are that those of you who are on Zoom can submit questions for the Q&A using the Zoom Q&A function. Those of you who are here in the room, we would ask for you to come up, if you are able, to use the microphone there in the middle, which allows the people online as well as the people here in the room to hear what you're saying. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. And I will now turn things over to our moderator, Lenna Garibian. Lenna.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to NAASR for co-sponsoring tonight. A big thanks also to Silva Sargsyan and Jilozian for their support in bringing tonight to fruition. I also want to give a shout out to another co-sponsor of ours, which is AWA, the Armenian International Women's Association. In 2010, AWA was a founding sponsor of the Women's Support Center, along with a grant from USAID and the Tufankian Foundation, and they have been a continued supporter since then. And we appreciate that continued support, that sustainable support. In the audience is Zella Sargsyan, who's the vice president of this year's board. And Zella, thank you again for your support and your help organizing tonight. Before I begin and introduce our speakers, I just want to take a second to give you a sense of what we're going to do tonight. First of all, I'm very much looking forward to tonight's talk. As Mark mentioned, I've been excited about this topic for a long time. The issue of sort of equal rights for women is universally relevant, right? Equal rights, equal opportunities, equal protections, equal access to resources. These are critical pieces of any flourishing economy, any flourishing democracy, Armenia included. What we are going to do tonight is we're going to track the trajectory of the women's movement starting in about 2008 to the present. And Ani and Nelli will have very, very sort of different lenses into the trajectory. And of course, movements, they don't happen in isolation, so they are going to be weaving in other broader social movements and political events, including the 2020 war in Armenia and the 2023 Artsakh crisis and sort of the reverberating effects of those crises. So I think it's going to be a really interesting opportunity to hear about this movement through these very different perspectives. And while I've been excited for a while about this event, I don't think we anticipated that we would be doing this event tonight, just weeks after a historic vote in Armenia that took place on April 12, which essentially strengthened the current laws in Armenia that protect all people from domestic violence. These are important pieces of legislation, and Ani's going to talk about them more. But we were very, very, very excited to hear this, see the passage of this. And I was speaking to Maro Matosian, who's the executive director of the Women's Support Center, on the phone just days after the vote. And she said to me, if we cease to exist tomorrow, if our organization stopped functioning, we will still have left a lasting impact on what it means to be an Armenian citizen. The changes that we've made are that important. So I think it's something to be really proud of, even while sometimes the news from Armenia isn't wonderful. This is something I think we can all be really, really proud of. We're going to hear a lot more about that, but I just wanted to start there. Let me introduce our speakers and we can get started. With us tonight are Ani Jilozian. She's on the far side there. Ani is a women's rights advocate with a master's degree in global public health from the Icahn School of Public Health at Mount Sinai. Ani is the director of development at the Women's Support Center. In her role there, Ani has mobilized resources for the center, led gender-based violence programming, and published research studies that examine gender-based violence, women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, and gender politics in Armenia. She's involved in high-level advocacy and has contributed to shadow and alternative reports. Next to me is Nelli Sargsyan. Nelli is an associate professor of anthropology at Emerson College in Boston. At Emerson, Nelli is the coordinator of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Study minor. In her scholarly artistic work and teaching, Nelli is interested in stretching disciplinary boundaries to explore the multisensory possibilities of feminist world-making. Nelli's most recent work focuses on reproductive justice in conditions of militarization and life-sustaining relationships across borders of states and species. Nelli's work has appeared in academic journals such as History and Anthropology, Feminist Anthropology, Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies, and Political and Legal Anthropology Review, as well as online platforms such as Art Margins, Ms. Magazine, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. All right, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
That was a mouthful, guys. All right, so we're going to start with sort of an introduction by each of the panelists, and we're going to start with Nelli. So Nelli, to kick us off, I'd like to invite you to start the discussion by framing this trajectory of the women's justice movement in Armenia.
Thank you so much, Lenna. So I want to also echo Mark and Lenna and thank NAASR, WSC, Women's Support Center, and Iowa for the support, for co-sponsoring of this event, and also particularly you, Lenna, for reaching out and organizing the event. So as Lenna said, my work focuses on women's justice struggles, and more specifically, I work with people who self-identify as feminists in Armenia, and the way that I define feminism is this justice work that pays attention to power relations and centers the lives and interests of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, and works towards a world in which every life is precious and no one individual's or group's life comes at the expense of another's. So this is the lens through which I will be using the word feminist and feminism. And while there isn't exactly a feminist movement in Armenia that I could pinpoint, there has been for a long time feminist work through grassroots organizing, public scholarship, artistic practices, also through work in non-governmental organizations. And the folks that I work with or I collaborate in Armenia primarily work independently. They intentionally don't organize themselves into non-governmental or don't register as non-governmental non-governmental organizations. So different women's organizations or feminists work together on a variety of issues, and some as organizations like Women's Support Center or Women's Resource Center, or as a coalition to stop violence against women that did important work on this domestic violence law that Ani will talk about, and others do as grassroots initiatives. And since 2007, when the work of youth and social-driven grassroots initiatives gained more attention, the official discourses in Armenia started referring to these initiatives. Let's say they're raising issues of environmental justice, or fighting against turning Terut forest into a mine, as civic initiatives. And civic initiatives, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have been associated with women. More women are employed in both NGOs and civic initiatives. And in the Armenian official discourses, there is this distinction between civic and political, and women are relegated to this civic area where they do different kinds of justice struggles, and then men run the political life through state governance and businesses. But for feminists, all this work in all these areas is important work, and is political work towards more equitable life for all, as you were mentioning earlier. So some of these initiatives, like Terut Forest, Safe Terut initiative, that feminists organized to advocate for a forest to stay forest instead of turning into a mine, or Occupy Mashtots Park in 2012, when again a group of feminists as the key organizers also worked with individuals or people from different political persuasions and organizations to keep a public urban park a park, and against the mayor's decision to give licenses to turn the public park into private boutiques. And they succeeded in that. They would also organize events to, boycott this conference that the government was organizing on responsible mining, to point out that it's only a facade. There is no such thing as responsible mining if the rivers are being polluted, if people's land is being polluted, the air is being polluted, and their lives are being affected negatively. Or they would raise awareness of domestic violence and demand a domestic violence law, or protest against deaths or murders in the army when there were no military actions taking place, but no one was being held accountable, and those who came from more vulnerable backgrounds and serving in the army, were mysteriously dying by suicide. This was the official language for them. Or they would, demand investigation into March 1st events from 2008, when after presidential elections, a large number of people protested because they were fraudulent, but 11 peaceful protesters were killed. So women have always been at the forefront of, raising these issues of inequity and injustice. But in the social, imagination, men are imagined, in the Armenian context, are imagined as the leaders, or those who make important decisions, or lead the nation. So even though women, and particularly feminists, have been practicing, this decentralized, nonviolent, and methods of protesting, and some of which I already mentioned, and have been engaged in consciousness-raising workshops to investigate sources of power, to invest in collective power, raising awareness in a younger generation about issues of injustices, or working on fairy tales with children who live in border villages to amplify their imagination, to imagine life beyond militarization, beyond war. When all these creative methods were used in 2018, when the regime change took place, the faces of what came to be known as the revolution of love and solidarity were all men, and women were framed as just supporters, or those who were helping out, rather than those who had been practicing these decentralized, creative and ways of organizing and nonviolent methods of working towards social change. While at the same time, when that was taking place, they were still writing texts analyzing how even that movement in 2018 was unfolding, to point out that people have power in themselves, because there was this period from 2016, especially after the 4-day escalation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, of helplessness, that nothing is going to ever change. So 2018 brought this hope of, of possibility that something can change. And a lot of that work that people together did was similar tactics that feminists had been using on smaller scales, but practiced at a larger scale. These strikes, large-scale strikes, or creative ways of stopping business as usual. And also, as organizations or coalitions, different feminist organizations and groups would come together under this coalition called the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women, and worked on this legislature in 2017, that domestic violence legislation, which at the time was called Preventing Violence in Families and Protecting the Individuals Experiencing Violence in Families and Restoring Harmony in Families. So they did important work on, on the language of the law, because the previous iteration of the law was called Preventing Domestic Violence and Protecting Individuals Experiencing Domestic Violence. And yet the focus of the law at that time became on just violence in the family and restoring family harmony, which does not focus on the needs of the person. In oftentimes it was gender-based violence against women. It's not the interests or needs of the person experiencing the violence, but now that they're forced to create harmony with their potential abuser. So they fought hard, and Ani, in her section, will talk about the most recent amendments and the latest iteration of the law. And energized by the 2 minutes?
Yeah, I mean...
Energized by the 2018 shift, Armenian feminists, environmentalists worked with people near the mountain Amusar that was in the works to be, again turned into a mine. And they continued their collaboration and amplified the voices of the people on whose daily lives this mine was going to have impact. So again, centering the lives and livelihoods and interests of those who would be most impacted if this mine were to operate. But they would do a lot of research and sharing of information, sharing education about the impact of the operation of the mine, but also discussing alternatives to mines and the short-sightedness of choosing the mine. I will talk about what happened after the 2020 war, because there was a dramatic shift after the war. It's in 10 minutes, it's difficult to talk about all the different things and initiatives that women in general and feminists in particular in Armenia have been involved, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have, but I just wanted to give some snippets of the kinds of work that they have been involved in towards economic and environmental justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Nelli. Ani, so Nelli did speak to the domestic violence legislation and domestic violence overall. Can you give us a bit of the landscape of sort of the evolution of and the changing landscape of domestic violence in Armenia, same time period?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nelli, to really eloquently describing the entire landscape around feminist social justice movements. I will speak specifically to gender-based violence and the social movement around that particular issue, because it's what I've been most closely working on for the past decade and a half. So just to kind of draw you, to paint a picture for you of kind of where we were when we got started and where we are now. And before I describe to you the newer developments, I just wanted to kind of lay a foundation. So when we started this work in 2010, it was the Women's Support Center. It was in response to a horrific case of domestic homicide, of femicide. This was a woman by the name of Medzorian who was brutally murdered by her husband. And in 2010, this moment was really the first time that people were publicly speaking about the issue of domestic violence. And it was really the first time that this issue and this case sent shockwaves throughout the public. Because up until this point, domestic violence was highly shrouded, it was highly stigmatized, and it was taboo to speak about. And domestic violence was really considered an intimate family matter and not something to openly speak about. And when we were speaking about domestic violence, as feminists, as activists, we were often attacked for quote unquote breaking up the traditional family, and we were accused of kind of overblowing the issue and making it into something larger than what it was. But this was a moment that really kind of shifted that perception, and feminist activists, human rights activists went to the streets to protest what was going on, because we understood that there was really little to no services available to victims. There was a societal tolerance for this crime, and there was nothing at an institutional level in place. There was no political will to address this issue. And so we used kind of that momentum. We came together as a coalition. Nelli mentioned the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women. And we pushed back on this for many years, campaigning, giving interviews. We started leveraging media coverage of high-profile court cases. So these were cases of domestic violence that in 2012 and 2013 were being covered. And it was the first time that we actually got media to come to the courtroom to actually see in real time women survivors giving their testimonies, which was so powerful. Seeing in real time victim blaming, that was judges, prosecutors, investigators were all playing a part in. seeing in real time what was happening just outside of the courtroom as activists, as the survivors themselves were being threatened and even physically assaulted. So really this kind of brought a lens for the first time into the public. And from that point, we started seeing a lot more coverage of domestic violence cases, not always sensitively, especially in the beginning, where people's information or pictures or names were being put in the press. But we started to see more coverage of this issue and more articles being published. And again, building that kind of momentum for the kind of change that we wanted to see. And we also, at the same time, were really heavily focused on legislative reform. So even from back in 2013, we were trying very hard to pass a domestic violence law. As a coalition, members of the coalition, we were drafting amendments, we were in conversation with state actors, and we were putting a lot of pressure on them. In the early days, there was a lot of activism on the streets. There was a lot of knocking on doors and shouting to be heard. By the time 2017 rolled around, we had a lot of grassroots pressure for many years building up, but then we also had a moment where there was a significant amount of top-down pressure coming from the European Union, which made passing a domestic violence law contingent on receiving state support. So with the grassroots pressure, with the top-down influence, we finally did get a domestic violence law in 2017. This law was flawed in many ways and had many gaps in it, didn't protect survivors to the extent that we had hoped. And Nelli kind of alluded to this with the title of the law, which had a focus on reconciliation between victim and perpetrator. And at the time, there was a lot of pressure for the state coming from, we had ultra-nationalists and kind of right-wing groups and individuals who were really pushing back against this. So in a sense, changing the title of the law was a sort of concession to just get the law passed. It did set a really important foundation for protecting survivors and punishing perpetrators, but it left a lot open as well. So I wanted to fast forward from this point in time to 2018. Nelli mentioned the Velvet Revolution, and this was also a really important milestone for us working in this field because we had a lot of civil society, people from civil society, activists themselves actually taking positions in government and high-level positions. So for the first time, we had advocates and we had political will to address the issue of domestic violence, gender-based violence. There wasn't always resources or capacity necessarily to do this, but there was an open door and an open line of communication. And so all of the work that we were doing kind of on the streets, protesting, campaigning, leveraging media, now we were sitting around round tables discussing how to improve legislation, how to put forward internal orders to improve the police response. So the way that we were working as civil society changed. It became a bit more, I guess, professionalized, if you will. But the end goal was the same, and it's to eradicate gender-based violence. So we had in 2018 this sort of pivotal moment, and we started working more with state bodies, and in particular the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, which to this day we work very closely with. And then there was another moment in 2019, 2020, where the ministry came to us to lead a nationwide program to establish domestic violence support centers in every province of the country. So we now have our center in Yerevan. Up until that point, most services were centralized in Yerevan, but now we have a network of domestic violence support centers, one in each region, and what we were able to do with support from the ministry was sort of map out which organizations exist, which women's organizations are there on the ground doing this work, and train them, mentor them, coach them, and take a unified approach to addressing domestic violence throughout the country. So now these centers all use our same intake forms. They use our same referral procedures. They use our same risk assessment procedures. Everything has been standardized so that the response is unified. And this is also really significant in improving the response. So now we have a more robust response. We're able to support women in some of the most rural and remote parts of the country. And as Lenna mentioned, now we have a moment just a couple weeks back where we have new amendments. So this was actually a long time coming. We were working with members of parliament, with the ministry, and with others for actually 2 years. There was a lot of deliberation around these amendments and a lot of back and forth, and of course a lot of pushback because there were conservative members of parliament who, for instance, didn't like the fact that we were introducing the term intimate partner violence, which then made it so that all victims from all walks of life, whether they're in a registered marriage, whether they're in a same-sex union, can all receive support under the law and seen as domestic violence victims. So that's one major change that the amendments brought. The other thing that it does is it defines domestic violence better. So every form of domestic violence, physical, psychological, sexual, and economic, are better defined under the law, which is also really important when it comes to legal cases and prosecution. What we have now is also broader support for registered victims. So they now have free of charge. Well, this will be enforced in July, so I should say that this will be enforced at a later time. But with these new amendments, we will now have free of charge medical care for victims. Now, children who are witness to violence, to domestic violence in the home, are also seen as victims. This is also really, really important. And then it also puts into place an accountability mechanism for perpetrators. So there are more harsher sanctions for perpetrators who abuse their loved ones. There are now more stringent measures around police warnings, when police can provide warnings, and when they should issue emergency protective orders. And then the length of time in which emergency protective orders are valid and protective orders that are issued by court are valid have also been extended. So now women who are in or leaving abusive situations have more time to find safety, to relocate, and to deal with their paperwork. So there's a whole host of things that have changed, and we are hopeful in this moment that this will translate to real change for women and survivors of domestic violence in the country.
Thank you. Thank you. What's remarkable about that is it's just over a decade from the beginning to end to end, all of that progress. Mm-hmm. It's pretty amazing. So Ani, I know that in addition to all of this advocacy work and the sheltering that the Women's Support Center does, the center has provided a lot of refugee support in the aftermath of the 2020 war and then also 2023. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing for refugee support of families and women?
Absolutely. When the war happened in 2020, it was a shock to everyone. Women's organizations, feminists, individuals, everyone mobilized to do what they could to support the humanitarian effort. And women's organizations and feminists also played a really important role here. Our organization in particular, the Women's Support Center, was actually a registered distribution point. And so we would receive relief aid packages. We would package them, distribute them to women and their families who were most in need. We did the same in 2023 when we had the forced displacement. And again, that's something significant that I think sometimes is often overlooked, kind of the role of feminists doing this work. But I want to say beyond the distribution of aid, which is itself very important, women's organizations, feminists, they offer a particular lens in which to see conflict and to respond to the conflict. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. In 2020, when the relief packages were going out, it was feminists who saw that the relief packages were missing really important things. For instance, families were being given dry rations of food, but not cookware to cook the food with. And we were getting reports from women and their families that they simply couldn't use the aid that was being given to them. Another important thing was menstrual hygiene, which was being left out of initially those hygiene kits that were being distributed. So this is the place in which women's specialist services, women's organizations, and feminists really have that kind of particular lens in which to see things and respond to them. So it was our interventions that we were able to hear the voices of women coming to us and translate them and make sure that they were receiving the aid that they need. But that's one small example. Another thing that we did as a women's organization was a lot of outreach. So we understand that conflict exacerbates gender-based violence. This is the case all around the world, and we know that this is the case for Armenia. And even though it's impossible to have real numbers of how many people are affected, because we know that what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, we have seen that when we do outreach, when we did outreach to the collective shelters, to women in those collective shelters in 2020, post-war, we saw an immediate impact of that, where we were getting referrals to our center. So we know that this was important. And, I kind of laid out the landscape around domestic violence and how kind of it was this silent crime in 2010. Well, in Artsakh, it was very much like that in 2020, because this was a population that never had really domestic violence services available to them, didn't have legislation to address domestic violence. And so in many ways, this was domestic violence, gender-based violence was kind of shrouded in stigma in the same way that it was in Armenia, a decade earlier. So this outreach is really important because it was maybe the first time for many people that they understood that what they were experiencing was domestic violence, and they also understood for the first time what services existed for them in the country in which they had to relocate. So this was really important. One thing that we saw was that, there's direct outreach, which can be successful to some degree, and then there's kind of more indirect ways of addressing the issue. And something that we started actually prior to 2023, but something that we did during the crisis, was we started offering what we call safe spaces programming. And what this is simply at all of the domestic violence support centers in the regions, opening our doors up to women to just collectively come together. And what we did was we offered them workshops on self-care, on parental skills. We did art therapy, various different forms of art therapy. So the idea was to bring those women who were now in their new communities together to build community again. And what we did was, it also provided them with a sort of outlet to air their concerns, their grievances, to bond with one another. And what we tried to do during these programs was to also very gently also talk about issues of gender-based violence and what was happening. And this was another really important way in which we were able to reach people. And we again saw a direct impact of that with a lot of referrals coming to our organizations. So this in a nutshell is kind of, I see the unique role of women's specialist support services in times of conflict, and this is the role that we were also able to play.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Nelli, Ani spoke about the women services, specialist services. I'd love for you to now talk to us a little bit about, delve deeper into collective war trauma and healing. I know this is an area of your study and currently, so give us some background on what this is.
So the way that I'm approaching that question that you're asking, Lenna, is that I was noticing that, first, after the war, after 2020, again, feminists were engaged in the activities that Ani was pointing out, and also through mutual aid, providing raising funds and providing medication, clothing, places to live to people as they're working, through this shock that they've experienced with displacement or losing loved ones, and then also, having like 5,000, over 5,000 young, I can say kids because they could have been my kids, that were killed in their 20s. And so as part of this, when there weren't really any infrastructures in place to care for those who had lost their children, and one thing that the Armenian government did that was to encourage people to have more children was the Armenian government had this assisted reproductive technologies available to people before the war, to people and up to the age of 42 if they lived in border areas or if they came from military households. But after the war, that was raised to 53. So any woman up to the age of 53 now can, apply and have children. So at first, my reaction was shock. I was kind of horrified because I thought, people are experiencing this intense grief of loss. And instead of first putting systems in place to take care of them, to heal, the government is pushing them, okay, have more children so then they can grow up and, become soldiers and go die again. So that was my initial reaction. And, I was worried that now we're going to have like a generation of what different scholars call replacement children. So these kids are born as a result of this intense trauma and their families having lost their children, and they're not going to have their own lives because they live in the shadow of a sibling they didn't even know, but it's kind of comfort to their parents. And so I was doing this kind of media analysis because the Armenian media was exalting, calling them hero-bearing mothers who had just also buried, their kids and who were, referred to as, heroes. And things like as long as the Armenian mother bears a child with, tears still on her face, the fate of the nation is safe. But to me, as a feminist, this, it means, I was thinking, their needs are not met. The people are not cared for, and just the focus is on just to increase the number of, to grow the population. And on top of that, in 2023, the Armenian government, Lydian, this corporation that had been trying to mine at Amusar, and Eurasian Bank of Development signed an agreement to actually start the mining process. So to me, that's also tied to not creating livable conditions, because operating the mine is a slow death, then war is quick, immediate death, and then there's also this domestic violence. So different kinds of violence were present, and that don't provide for conditions where reproductive justice. And the definition of reproductive justice that I'm using is from Sister Song, having bodily autonomy, deciding to have kids or not, and being able to raise your kids in sustainable communities, without violence, which allows thriving, allows opportunities for healing. But then, as I started that research and then I started interviewing people, I was noticing that in the absence of systematic structure or systems or structures of support, of healing or care, or creating conditions for people to be able to parent safely and sustainably, in which their kids have access to clean water, clean air, good food. These parents were taking these things into their own hands. So this was their version of healing, and it was again, in a way, gendered on the shoulders of women. And even if the government's agenda is to grow the population so that you have more people serving in the army, there's a range of ways that people who are having their new babies were approaching this. In a way, it allows them to live and patch together a version of a life that seems to be beyond a repair, and at the same time allows them to, complete their culturally sanctioned parenting, so that, you're happy for, you have a kid, you can express happiness, you can, now you're obligated to attend to their needs and, help them grow and provide safe, conditions for their growth. So my hypothesis shifted, because I started viewing this as a range of ways of taking this into their own hands, taking their own healing, working through their own trauma into, their hands, rather than thinking that because these systems of healing are not in place, people are just following what's, just taking on passively what's being given to them and just producing these future soldiers for the nation. Yeah.
This is not an uncommon response, right, for countries that are in a crisis, right? I mean, I feel like this particular lens, this unique one in terms of hero-bearing mothers, potentially, but the sort of the push towards the family values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair to say?
Not uncommon, the push towards family values.
When there is a nation in crisis, in the feminist literature?
So when there is, yes, it creates the ground for claiming. If you mean, well, I guess this is how I'm thinking, that it creates grounds for, more violence or hierarchical relations, or not attending to the needs of the most vulnerable. And at the same time, I'm also finding out through my research that there are counselors that work with people, and again, different organizations started mobilizing. Working with families that have whose kids were killed, in the war. So, for example, one of my research participants had two sons who were in the war, and one of them was killed, and the other one, survived. Who has this survivor's guilt, and just could not interact with any family members for a long time. Didn't want to. It was difficult for him. So there's a counselor who's working with him, and also he now that has like a new baby sibling is taking on this care role, for the sibling. So there is there are some systems that are emerging that are in place for.
Yeah. So you will continue to do work in this area? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. I just started it last year.
Ani, does this story sound familiar to you in terms of what you're seeing on the ground? I mean, or is it just?
No, I mean the phenomenon of hero-bearing mothers is in the news quite a lot, and it's not uncommon for mothers or the family members to decide to give the same name of the lost son to the new sibling, right? No, this is, I don't know, I don't have numbers, but this is certainly a trend that we've seen. And like you said, it puts the burden on the woman, again, to bear the child, to raise the child, and potentially lose her child. Again, I mean, it's a really sad situation.
Yeah, so interesting. Something for us to watch. Thank you so much. So we are nearing time, so I wanted to leave some time for the audience to ask questions. I know we covered a lot of ground tonight across a whole range of topics, but curious to know if anybody in the audience has specific issues either around domestic violence or around the sort of this trajectory of feminism that Nelli spoke to. Any questions in the audience?
And please, if you're able, come up and use the microphone so that everyone can hear you online as well. And folks online, please use the Zoom Q&A to submit questions.
Thank you all so much. My question is, it may not even be very appropriate, but I'm going to ask it. Is there any space for restorative justice in the processes that you find, since this is a cultural, familial phenomenon, domestic violence, in terms of healing or just being heard, for women to be heard?
What do you mean by restorative justice?
Well, like circles, where the harmer and the harmee are in the same space and can be heard together.
Yeah. I've only read about this theoretically, in literature on this topic. It's not something that we've really thought about, I suppose, or I should speak for myself, that I've thought about in the context of Armenia. I think it's probably, and I'm just thinking out loud, it's a great question. I think it's maybe premature to consider that model for Armenia, only because we're in a situation where we've only started putting together the basic foundation for supporting victims, and we're still working on that. And any talk of restorative justice, when you don't have a proper framework for supporting victims, almost seems like it would be fit to fail from the beginning. Like, you need a foundation first. And this also, I think, stretches to work with perpetrators generally. Right now, there's a newly developed probation department, and they're trying to pilot a work with perpetrators, which again must happen at some point. There needs to be a rollout of perpetrator programs. But again, the situation is such that we're still fighting for basic things, basic gaps in the criminal justice response to be fixed first. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Right now, we're dealing with a trend where we have the police response improving, and police are issuing emergency protective orders at a higher rate every year. But now the administrative court is overturning the police-issued emergency protective orders more and more every year. So we have a negative trend there. And again, this speaks to many of the gaps that we're seeing, and not just in terms of these protective orders, but also in the sense that there's very little sensitivity among criminal justice actors in the response to victims. So with this kind of landscape in mind, at the very best, a work with perpetrators, or what you were suggesting with restorative justice, at best would probably be ineffective, and at worst could even make the situation worse, because we know that perpetrators often use their involvement in these programs as a sort of bargaining chip to get back in relationships with the victim. So again, I think these things are probably premature, but they're absolutely worth thinking about in the long term.
Can I also? I have a different perspective on this, because I very much appreciate restorative justice approach. At the same time, it requires that the person who did the violent act acknowledge and recognize that they committed violence. But oftentimes in the situations that you're describing in Armenia, and it's gender-based. Oftentimes it's men, right, being violent towards women. They think, because of the systemic thinking that I am the man of the house, like I was saying in this, social imagination, men do this, and they have power over women. Then it's not conceived of as violence. Mm-hmm. It's conceived of keeping your woman in check. Mm-hmm. And he's a passionate guy, or he just I don't know, got heated or something, or he's there are different thinking. So I think it would be important to keep restorative justice practices in mind and see, because when people act violently towards their partner, it's a signal about larger systems in place that enable their attitudes. So, we want to work on those other, larger systems. So, in education, in relationships, what do we need to change so that the violence doesn't occur? And then when it occurs, then we engage in restorative rather than punitive ways of dealing, which is like, so abolitionist feminists take that approach, not punitive, but these kinds of restorative practices. So I would love to see that also practiced in Armenia, but it can't be an individual thing. Other things need to also change in
absolutely.
terms of relationships.
Oh, thank you for sharing that perspective. It absolutely requires acknowledgement and a different mindset around what domestic violence is. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great question.
I have online questions as well, but you go in whatever. Please.
Just a quick question about LGBTQ rights. I'm curious about, in the last few years with this new trauma, if there's been a trend away from as much advocacy. For many years, I saw it increasing, and women were on the front lines of much of that advocacy. But has this recent trauma somehow dampened enthusiasm for really outspoken advocacy for LGBTQ rights, or is it still continuing apace? I know there's been a lot of common ground built among different groups, but I'd be interested in your perspectives.
Do you want to take this first?
It's like I was saying that anytime that there is like this like a larger scale crisis or practice, people who are most vulnerable, even when there are no wars or crises, become even more so. I mean, there, LGBTQ or queer activism is still ongoing, and many of them have been so active and engaged in mutual aid, in providing support. Doing justice work doesn't just focus on one issue in my interpretation and understanding. And so I know many queer feminists who were just working day and night to find shelter, clothes, food, and distribute to forcibly displaced people after the war. Or create spaces for folks who otherwise would not have those kinds of spaces. And so, yes, the antagonism towards queer people continues, and in times of war it intensifies. But I wouldn't say that. I don't know about dampening or not, but. The fact that there is attention away, or this is an opportunity again to not attend to their needs. Yes, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I would also, just to echo what Nelli was saying, I would say from my perspective, there hasn't been a dampening of activism, queer activism, but there has been some caution, maybe is the right word, around it, because we've seen that when it's politically convenient, the LGBT issue is always brought into the forefront. We saw this in 2013 when there was anti-gender campaigning and backlash, and there was a huge attack on LGBT activists in particular. And this was around the time where Armenia was shifting away from the European Union and toward the Eurasian Economic Union. So it was this right moment, right, politically, to sort of use the LGBT card to rally the masses. And they do that when, it's politically convenient. So there isn't, anything to stop that from happening in the future. And it very well likely there might be another, huge kind of anti-gender campaigning movement again around, this time, because we're in conflict, there's political instability and so on. So I think there's caution from my perspective, but activism remains, constant. Yeah.
Thank you. I had one comment and then one question. The comment relates to the restorative justice idea, which, in my understanding, one facet of it in the U.S. context is people of color communities wanting to avoid putting someone into a vulnerable position, calling a cop on a black or brown man who are already threatened in that system. So to translate that to Armenia, I can imagine that might be something happening in the queer community, that a gay or queer couple or a trans couple might make decisions like that, and I would be curious to hear anything along those lines. I think Pink Armenia has been doing work with domestic violence in the queer community. Mm-hmm. And then my question is, Lenna, you had mentioned this response about the hero-bearing woman isn't uncommon after a conflict, but what my mind went to was 1915, and that it wasn't uncommon, and it was a practice for families to have children and rename them. And so I'm wondering, here we are 100 years later, and so many of us have seen the patterns repeating from 1915 through 2020 and 2023. So my question is, also speaking, Nelli, to what you asked or what you raised, if this is a moment for giving cultural space to grief and healing, what roles are women taking in that regard, and what roles are they taking in terms of Armenian agency in seeking justice and in calling out this moment of ethnic cleansing that we are seeing, not getting the attention it deserves, etc.
Mm-hmm. So what role are women taking in calling out the silence on ethnic cleansing? Is that what you said?
In this moment,
yeah.
And also in terms of grief and healing culturally.
It's difficult. I mean, some things that people have been doing is just writing texts or participating in solidarity events with Palestinians, or recognizing, as coming from a people who experienced a genocide and noticing one unfolding and speaking against it, pointing out similar patterns. So it seems little, but it's also meaningful in terms of it's easy to feel helpless. So when people that during those 6 days were getting in the cars and leaving Karabakh, I felt in my body what it must have felt like for other scholars or intellectuals of the time to see that, and or I don't know, Hrimian Heidik said, I went to the Berlin conference with a paper ladle and everyone had metal or, other kinds, and mine got stuck in. So the futility of your knowledge that you have, or that you thought that's some kind of power to impart to, I don't know, people with whom you're working as an educator. I'm talking about myself. And then, though, that's all you have access to, language and protest, or writing to your elected officials. So you engage in all of those activities, but also stand with those who are also experiencing genocide. I don't know if I'm fully answering your questions, but it could potentially speak to the difficulty of that moment, or the recognition that, when you come from a small people, it's difficult to get attention or feel supported by others. So you gather with those who share that experience and support each other. It's not a satisfying answer, Nancy John, but that's what I have here. I don't know if you have anything else. But did I answer all your questions?
So from one of the Zoom attendees, can you talk about villages versus cities, how the crises have been addressed in rural as opposed to urban settings?
How the crisis was addressed?
Yeah, how the crises, unspecified, but the situations that you've been discussing tonight, how does it differ dealing with situations in the cities versus in the small towns and villages?
So I'm unclear for...
So maybe I can clarify, so if someone's experiencing domestic violence in a village, can they access
Yes.
you? Is there a hotline they can reach, or do they know what to do?
So I mentioned briefly that we established regional centers in every province. So this really took kind of domestic violence being centralized in the capital to then being extended out, services being extended out throughout the country, with the hopes that we're reaching the most rural and remote parts of the country. And our data does show this, because the women's organizations that are working in those regions are really embedded in their local communities. And these are small communities to begin with, where the community members know one another, and they know where to go. And we've been now shifting a lot of our work from awareness raising in Yerevan to actually, bringing more awareness to these regional services, so that those, in very rural and remote communities know where to go to find. There are still, there's still a lack of certain capacities. So, for example, all shelter services are still centralized in the capital, and one has to come to Yerevan to receive shelter support. Another thing is certain centers don't have criminal lawyers, they don't have certain specialists there, because there just simply aren't enough specialists in those regions. And so that's where we support them by taking on those cases as well. So what we've done is build a supportive network, if you will, and we come together not only to mentor and coach and support one another, but to actually provide support when it comes to managing a case or taking on a case. So this is what we do so that no one is left behind. But that being said, these very cut-off rural communities, they're going to have different barriers in place when it comes to reporting domestic violence. There's different challenges for them to receive support. So the services are there for them, but there are still kind of a multitude of barriers for those who are vulnerable in marginalized communities in very remote parts of the country.
Another question from online is about violence against married women at the hands of mothers-in-law. How widespread a problem this is, and how widely is it reported?
We have many reported cases of mother-in-law abuse, and it's not uncommon. It's actually fairly uncommon, unfortunately. And it's, this speaks to the sort of harmful gender norms and stereotypes that are still prevalent in society. And when we talk about, as feminists, patriarchal norms, this doesn't just affect the men in society. Women also take on those harmful norms and stereotypes and adhere to those bad practices. And when you're in a traditional home environment, it's very common for the cycle of abuse to continue generationally. So if a woman was subjected to abuse as a bride, as a daughter-in-law, then she herself might also then exhibit that same behavior. And that's why we call it a cycle of violence, because it is very cyclical. And breaking that cycle is part of the work that we're trying to do.
I have one more.
Oh, okay.
If there's anyone else in the room. Okay. This is a comment/question. It's regarding the issue of restorative justice. Even if the perpetrator understands that they are at fault, and even if they might benefit from non-punitive rehabilitation, it should not be required of the victim/survivor to be assisting in the restorative justice process. It may be an added burden for the survivor, and that needs to be respected. If you wish to comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point, and of course it should be up to the survivor whether or not she wants to engage in this. I only know from the American context, and I only know from textbooks, how this is handled. But there have been some successes and some failures with this model, as far as I understand. And ultimately, it can be healing in a certain circumstance or not, and absolutely should be left up to the survivor.
Nelli, you were saying that in the 2018 revolution, there was a lot of women feminists that were, instrumental in a lot of the protests, a lot of the activities, but that it hasn't translated into leadership or in the government now. Can you give some examples? Is there more? I mean, it sounds like there is some progress in terms of domestic violence legislation, but in the leadership of the government, do you see improvement?
There are still very few government officials that are women. But even those that are women, it's also interesting because before they became part of the government, they were engaged in this grassroots activist work. So, for example, Lenna, what's Lenna's last name? He was an MP. My gosh.
Zaruhi?
No, Lenna. Anyway, so before becoming a member of parliament, with
Nazarian.
Lenna Nazarian? Yeah, that's right. Lenna Nazarian was a grassroots activist fighting against mines. And also fraudulent elections, interrupted the report of the European Commission's report that said in 2013, Sargsyan's elections were, there were no major violations, and she would interrupt that, or was actively engaged in anti-mining activity, or proposing alternatives to mining. And then once they became, she became part of the government, this tenor changes. So even if, well, first of all, there are not too many, but even if there are, so I'm still interested in the politics. To what extent are you really centering the needs of those who are most affected, who are most vulnerable? And that's not the case. So, so then, you're being corrupted by the power or the system that you're joining. And even with this new government, there was this hope that the mining of Amulsar would not take place, because many who joined different government agencies were former grassroots activists. And yet, one after the other, they started leaving their government positions. And then declassified documents from one of the embassies of Western European countries in Armenia revealed that this Amulsar deal that the government made with this mining company and Eurasian Development Bank was because the war depleted the budget. And so they thought, even if there is a little money that will come into the state budget from the mining, they still chose that slow death route. And those in the government, whatever gender they were of, still, were behind it. So it's been disappointing in that sense, yeah.
8:45. Right. So we're at time because Nelli has to catch a train. So I think we would.
Can we applaud?
Yeah. I'm sorry, stop. Lastly, just on behalf of the Women's Support Center and AWA and NAASR, I just want to thank you all for being here. Certainly on the side of the Women's Support Center, there are some informational pamphlets in the back. Our annual report is there, an informational card if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do, donation cards, and if you're interested, just follow us on social media, stay in touch. I hope you'll stay engaged. That you're here is a big deal, so thank you so much. And I'll be around a little bit.
Yes, I was going to say too that these three organizations all would welcome your interest and support, and you can certainly find out more about all three tonight or online. And I'm sure you can donate online to all three organizations or join as well. So please do.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.